Okay, today what I'd like to do is again review with you. Not all of you have had a good biology course, or you may have had a biology course knowing that a lot of you are juniors and seniors. It may have been 5 years ago that you had a biology course, and frankly a lot has changed in that 5 years about how we look at living organisms, and we're going to try to address some of that today. So again, you've heard this. What do you define as a living organism? Yeah. Something that breathes, respires. Now, what's kind of interesting is that we're going to talk about bacteria of extremes in this lecture, and these bacteria of extremes are capable of living in an oxygen depleted or even it's kind of interesting. The real problem with some of these bacteria of extremes is that you can't rear them very easily because there are many of them, if they're exposed to oxygen, it's lethal to them. Wow. So I agree they respire, but they respire in a different way than what we would normally think of as using oxygen. These are organisms that are using things like sulfur and cyanide gas and things like that as part of their respiratory system. Well, generally, what I find is that people say, well, most living things grow. I'm a good example of that. I've grown quite well, and that is one of the attributes. But on the other hand, as a kid, I love making saturated salt solutions and growing crystals. And so crystals can, quote, grow, but I don't think we would consider those to be living organisms. Well, unless you're an old Star Trek fan in which there's this crystal entity that's supposedly alive or whatever. But at least what we know that's not true. We do know that we don't have a living organism that is 5 billion years old, at least as far as we know. And the reason for that is that organisms have to reproduce. And here's the deal. When you reproduce, you're going to find out that this course may make you uncomfortable. We are very open about sex in here and talking about sex, and the reality is in order to reproduce, what do we human beings have to do? We have to combine a sperm and an egg together. And what does that mean? What's in that sperm? Pardon? DNA, absolutely. Genetic material. And so if you really take reproduction down to that part of genetic material, there has to be a code that is transmitted from one organism to the next generation to tell them what to do and how to do it and so forth. And so reproduction, I think that's important, and it will be more important as we get to our final definition. You talked about respiration, usually that's true, but then there's some weird kinks in that when we get to, we know that these bacteria of extremes are living organisms. They do the rest of the thing. They grow, they reproduce, but when they respire, they may not be using what we think of as respiration oxygen. Here are some general definitions that we use. In general, you are made up of organic molecules. And what do we mean by an organic molecule? No, I'm not talking about it's something that you got at the organic section at Kroger. What we're talking about when we say organic is that it's made of these 4 most important elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Now, again, there's some theorists that think, the silicon and carbon kind of similar molecules. They're pretty closely related in the periodic chart, and so there are some people that are theorizing that there might be a silicon-based life somewhere. I'm not sure I buy into that. Okay, if you really get into the reason why carbon is so good as being the base element or the base molecule in our compounds is because it has a great deal of flexibility of how it joins with other atoms and so forth. And silicon doesn't quite have that flexibility. Generally, all living organisms need an energy source. Now, they may get that energy source. The most common energy source that we're familiar with is the sun. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the sun. And as a matter of fact, you would starve to death if it wasn't for the sun, because you eat plant material. Oh, well, yeah, I know. Sometimes we shuttle that plant material through another animal, and then we eat that animal. But in essence, we need plants that have chlorophyll, that make sugars and amino acids and proteins, and then we eat those and we digest those. So we need some sort of an energy source, whether it's directly, like a plant gets it straight from the sun, or we get it indirectly from the food that we eat. But again, some things have changed. If you get to those bacteria of extremes, these are ones that can directly use chemical energy and heat energy. You may have, I know not all of you watch the nature programs like I do religiously on TV, but maybe you have heard of the black smokers. These are things that are in the deep ocean where we have the continental drift opening up, and basically there's sulfur dioxide coming up and some other pretty nasty chemicals that would be lethal to us, but these bacteria of extremes use those as their energy source. Kind of pretty neat as far as I'm concerned. But in order to do that, they survive, they grow, and they then reproduce. To me, probably the most important thing that defines life here on planet Earth, as I have already indicated to you, is that there's a code. There's a code that transmits all the information that your cell needs and your body needs in order to survive and do what it needs to do and reproduce and make the next generation and so forth. And that's based in this genetic material. The basic genetic material, as far as we're concerned, is DNA. Every one of you have your own DNA, and this has become very important. Is my DNA the same as your DNA? 99.999999% of it is. Okay? But it's that little bitty difference that makes you have hair, I don't. And well, I won't go there. There's boys in here and girls in here and so forth. And your genetics makes that up. And most importantly, I suspect if you look at your parents, you'll probably see some similarity between you and your parents. There will be some things that you go, oh yeah, I look like, my nose looks like Dad's, okay? And wait a minute, Mom and Dad both had hair. Why do I not have hair? My grandfather on my mother's side was bald. Thanks, Mom. Well, no, thanks, Grandpa, through Mom. So we'll talk about that. And the other thing that you will learn when we talk about genetics, the one mantra that I want you to know about genetics when you leave this course, DNA, which is the basic code in all your cells, makes another code that's called RNA. That code leaves the nucleus of your cells and goes into the cytoplasm of the cells and is read by these little structures that are called ribosomes to make proteins. Proteins are the things that make you function or allow you to function. And so what the DNA code does is it makes proteins, and it's all those proteins that do everything else in our living bodies. So DNA makes RNA, and RNA makes proteins in our cells. Now, we're going to now have a review of what's called biological classification. Now, I'm not talking about nomenclature. Remember in the last lecture we talked about nomenclature and how we identify whether it's a phylum or a class or an order or species of animal. And I tried to point out to you that really the plant people and the bacteria people and the algal people are much more organized than ours, because you can tell from the endings of their scientific names where they stand. But when you get to biological nomenclature, it's really only at the family level. Above that, you have to look it up on the internet and say, well, what is this? I have no idea what a polychaeta is, and so I have to look that up. I'm going to sort of divide this up into non-cellular life. Now, why is a knowledge of non-cellular life important to you? Are you familiar with viruses? Have any of you had the flu? What do you know about most of the flus that we get? Why is it that you have to have a new flu shot every year? Yes, the genetic material. Now, what's interesting is most flu viruses and most viruses are actually RNA. So they're missing the DNA. So what does that mean? Well, they need something else. They need another cell to help them make the proteins that they make and make new RNA. So they're missing the DNA component of it, and that's very interesting. That's why we would consider them non-cellular life, because they're basically they're bits of RNA that hijack your cell. Now, what's the problem of hijacking your cell? They usually kill it in the process, and that's what makes you sick. Your cells are dying off because they become infected. What do you think viruses can infect? Any living cell. Bacteria get viruses. Wow. You may not have been aware of that, but that's really important to us in genetic engineering, because guess what we can do? We can engineer a piece of RNA, kind of like a virus, put it into a bacterium, change what the bacterium DNA and RNA has in it, and then we can insert that into your body and introduce some new genes to you, or modify some defective genes that you've got. Wow, that's pretty neat technology. But my feeling is you need to know about it. Now, what are the rest of these? Viroids and prions, they're basically the same thing as viruses, but much less complicated. Now, that doesn't mean they're less dangerous. To give you an example, mad cow disease is a prion. So it's just a little fragment of RNA that if you happen to ingest it by eating cow brains that haven't been properly cooked, you can get it also and screw up your brains. So there's some things that to me are important in biology and just in living. We're going to spend most of our day talking about the true cellular life, and I'm going to introduce to you today maybe a different classification than what you saw in high school. Most high schools now teach biology in what we call the 5 kingdom format. And frankly, we'll use the 5 kingdom format also in here, but I want you to notice that biologists are looking at another way of dividing up life. And the way that these biologists have divided up the life is that the 2 kinds of bacteria dominate everything. Wow. How can that be? Well, let's think about it. What's on your skin? Bacteria. What's in your gut? Bacteria. What's in your poop? Bacteria. What's in your ears? Bacteria. You are coated inside and out with bacteria. I know that might freak some of you out, but it's a fact of life. And as a matter of fact, when you take an antibiotic and get rid of the bacteria in your gut, what does it do? Man, you've got the dribble and poop for the going on now. And you'll probably have to eat something to reintroduce some of those bacteria in there. And I just saw a video a couple of weeks ago that people that do have to go through heavy courses of antibiotics and things like that are now taking poop capsules. What? Poop capsules. What is it? They've identified, in every region of the United States, they have these people that have ideal poop. And what they mean is that when they analyze the bacteria that's in these people's poop, it's sort of the right mix of the bacteria that we think you ought to have in your gut. So they actually extract the bacteria out of these people's poop and make it into a capsule. You can't heat it, you can't freeze it because that'll kill the bacteria that are in there. But you swallow these, and the capsule gets it through your stomach and into your small intestines, and then it opens up and introduces the bacteria back into you. Yeah. You know, in the past, we used to tell people to drink acidophilus milk and some of the other things that had some bacteria that were beneficial to you. But boy, if you want a good biome, eat a poop capsule and for that. Okay, we'll get to some of those. Now, briefly, what I wanted to talk to you about here is, again, how does a virus work? Now, in the case of viruses, remember that basically what a virus is a little packet of RNA, and often with a protein coating around it. And it's that protein coating that's really important, because it's the protein coating is usually what your white blood cells can detect. They can say, ooh, there's a foreign protein in here. We need to set up antibodies against that protein, and anytime those antibodies come into contact with that protein, they'll destroy it. And so that's the way that your own immune system attacks these things. But what's happening today, a lot of people are taking immunosuppressant technology. My wife takes immunosuppressants because she's got arthritis. And her body is attacking its own connective tissues. And so by taking this immunosuppressant, that suppresses her body's inclination to attack its own connective tissues. But by releasing that, that means that, boy, the minute she gets a cold, she stops the antisuppressants so that her natural immune system will come back on board and help and fight that cold virus. So to me, these are important things to understand. But in essence, when a virus gets into your body, how do you get viruses? Why is everybody doing this now? Yeah. Yeah, you're trying to keep from aerosoling spittle and snot into the air. Because if you've got a virus, if you've got especially a cold, let's think about it. Colds are exquisite. What do? They attack your nasal system and your lungs so that you'll sneeze and cough more. That's pretty neat way to get this done. But in essence, how do you get AIDS? Close, intimate contact with transmission of mucous materials. Does that sound familiar to you? Well, maybe some of you. Or sharing a needle. You know, somebody that's on drugs and has pulled a little blood out before they injected that toxin into their system. And then they go, here, you try this too. Well, that blood that was in that needle could carry that virus and transmit it to somebody else. Now, once the virus is in the body, and each virus attacks different kinds of cells, different locations, they're designed for this, but typically once they find the kind of cell that they're looking for, they fool that cell into thinking, oh, something is attached to me, it's a little piece of food, I'm going to take it in. And when it takes it in, the virus goes, hoo-hoo, I fooled you. I'm inside of you now. So I'm going to release my RNA. I'm going to hijack this system. I'm going to hijack the ribosomes in this cell. I'm going to turn off the cell's DNA so that that stops. But now the cell will make my proteins from my RNA, and more importantly, I'm going to have those ribosomes duplicate my RNA also. So that one virus body that got in there is capable of making this cell produce hundreds, thousands of new viral RNA, and at the end of it, that RNA instructs the cell how to construct the proteins to coat that RNA, and then when the cell dies, all of that's released again. That's a pretty neat system, but it's also pretty deadly to us and can make us pretty sick. Any questions on that? Yeah. We don't know. There are some theorists that have thought that maybe this could have been some early bacteria or something that they died and decomposed, but segments of their RNA were able to still function. Don't know. Great question, though. I wish I knew the answer. I'd win a Nobel Prize for that one. Yeah. Well, the virus doesn't have any mobility. of its own, but if it's in your body and a cell dies, those virus bodies then can infect the cells adjacent to that. If they get into the capillary system or your blood system, it's transported through your blood and so forth. And we've got some pretty nasty viruses out there. What's unique about the HIV virus is that it apparently knows how to keep changing its protein coat so that your antibodies never recognize it correctly. Okay, and so don't pick it up as something that's there. There are others. Some people may have other viruses. Have any of you had the chicken pox? What happens later in life if you've had chicken pox as a kid? You may get shingles. And shingles is no fun, folks. I hereby suggest to you strongly, we have a new shingles vaccine that's out there. The previous vaccine was really only about 50-60% effective. The new shingles vaccine is an improved vaccine. I just had it this last spring because I'm at that age where I could get it. It's more in the 80-85% effective. So hopefully I won't get shingles. I know some people that have had it. It's a terrible thing. But in essence, what happened is that virus found places in the body to hide. And it can remain dormant there until your immune system no longer recognizes it can come back out and reinfect you. Might as well pull in a point for human papillomavirus. What's that one? It's a virus of your reproductive system. Can you get it? Yeah. We've always considered it a lady's problem. No, the problem is that we guys were picking it up from an infected lady and then transmitting it to somebody else. So indeed, we guys can get it too. And it does increase our cancer risk also, just like it increases the cancer risk in women. So how do you make sure you don't get it? Well, don't have sex. I'm not sure I'd recommend that as the only way to do that. But you can get a vaccine for that. Okay, and so when your children are of the right age before you think they might be having sex, I'd strongly recommend that you have them vaccinated for that, both the boys and the girls. Now, we're going to move into true cellular life. And what do we mean by cellular life? These are things that the cells pretty well do all of the functions that they need. Now we're talking about having that DNA inside of them, producing RNA and producing proteins, and then allowing the proteins to do all the functions that are necessary for these cells. Now, basically there's two types of cells. We think the most ancestral cell are the cells that the DNA is really just kind of loose in the cell. It's usually centrally located, but it's kind of loose in the cell, and there's no what we call a cell membrane surrounding it. In other words, there's no nucleus in here. All of the cells that have no nucleus are called prokaryotes, bacteria. Both the regular bacteria and the bacteria of extremes are all prokaryotes. So then we find the rest of the living organisms, the nuclear material got more contained and defined in a very specific area, and we think there's a reason for that. As your DNA gets more complicated and the strands get longer and there's more genes involved in it, you need this stuff kind of put in a place where it makes it easy to replicate it and duplicate it and so forth. But on the other hand, when you've got these small chains of DNA kind of open, now that we know how to tinker with the genetics of this, it's really easier to tinker with the genetics of a bacteria than it is with a cell that has a nucleus in it. And it's just because of the complexity that's involved in those systems. But you're probably thinking, well, all of the living organisms are in this eukaryote. No. Remember, every plant, every animal has bacteria in it and on it. And now that we have the molecular genetic capability of teasing these out, in reality, those prokaryotes, the bacteria of extreme and the regular bacteria, there's probably more, quote, species of those than there are of all the plants and animals. Wow. That just makes my head spin, because that's not the way I learned it when I was your age. But it's the reality. We're finding out this is a reality. And actually, it's had to change the way that when we're investigating other worlds now, what we're trying to look at, we figure anywhere life may have started or evolved, probably started in the same sort of a system. There was probably these sort of primitive prokaryote type cells that were there. So now we're looking more for bacteria than we were before. We were looking for maybe single-celled algae and things like that. But now we're looking for bacteria because they would be a good indication of life. Yeah.
What do you mean by before kernel and with kernel?
That's just what those are the Greek and Latin prefixes of what those mean. Pro means before, karyote means kernel. And so what we're saying is that the kernel is the nucleus inside the cell. So bacteria have no nucleus, they have no kernel. And all the other plants and animals have that nucleus, so they have a kernel. This is kind of a crude graphic representation of a bacteria. And in this one, you can see the bacteria does have the sort of a cell wall, and a membrane in which most of the parts are on the inside of it. And this where it says the nucleoid region, that's basically where that DNA is located. It's in there. And it's kind of floating around. It might be on one end of the bacterium now, and a few minutes later it could be on the other end of the bacterium. But it's just kind of floating around in there. But again, it is making RNA, which then have to go to those ribosomes that we talked about. The ribosome reads that RNA and makes the proteins that are necessary for this bacterium to function. Many bacteria are mobile. They have what we call flagella, little wiggly things on the ends of them. Some bacteria have multiple flagella. And another thing that we found out, now that we have the ability to actually look at these with an electron microscope, we found out that bacteria flagella operate differently than animal flagella operate. The structure is different. Function's the same. These things wiggle and propel the organism forward or move things along. But the reality is there is a structural difference between those two, and that helps us in the identification of these. Now, when we talk about the eukaryotes, we can kind of divide these in. Traditionally, we divided them into plant and animal cells, but we have to realize that also in these eukaryotes, this will also include the protozoa. It's going to include the fungi. So there's more to it than just that, but we're going to kind of look at plant versus animal cells. Now, when you take a look at this plant cell, the thing that I want you to notice most importantly is that there's, in this diagram, it's red here, but it's probably clear if you actually looked at it. That is the cell wall made out of cellulose. Most plants have cellulose cell walls in them. You don't have cellulose. As a matter of fact, there's a good reason why you don't have cellulose. If you eat a plant, what do you digest out of that plant? Everybody suggests this. Eat lots of plant material and you'll have a better poop tomorrow. Why? It's fiber. Yeah. It's indigestible fiber. You do not have cellulase, which is an enzyme that helps break apart cellulose. And so it's something that you can digest most of the rest of the stuff inside of that cell, as long as you can break that cell apart, which, how do you do that? Don't you chew your food? There's a reason why we chew our food. Okay, it's to break the cells apart and the pieces apart so we can get to the cellular stuff that's on the inside of that and digest it. And of course, we use chemicals in our digestive tract to help us with that. To me, other than that cell wall, most plants, now there's a few plants that have figured out other ways to get energy other than from the sun. Most plants will have what we call a little organelle in there that will appear green. And those are the chloroplasts. That's where the chlorophyll is located. That's where the little engine inside that cell is that is making sugar using sunlight and carbon dioxide and water and mixing them together and making sugar. Why do we need sugar? Yes, it's what we burn. It's what our cells burn. Whether you're a plant cell or an animal cell, you both burn sugar to get energy that drives all the functions on the inside of that. It says that plants can make their own sugar during the daytime, and then they can burn that sugar during the nighttime when there's no sunlight. But you have to eat plants or eat animals that have eaten plants in order to get those sugars to get your energy. You can't make your own sugars.